A single tap. That is all it takes to make a nervous system collapse in on itself. Somewhere out there, a person who convinced everyone, including themselves, that they did not need anyone, is staring at a locked screen and feeling something they have no name for. Silence has a texture. Most people never learn this. The avoidant is learning it right now, and it is teaching them something no conversation ever could. There is a question buried inside this moment that most people are too afraid to ask out loud. What happens inside a person who built an entire identity around control? The instant control is taken away without warning, without negotiation, without a final word. This is not a story about revenge. This is not a story about winning. Something far more dangerous is happening beneath the surface, something that reveals exactly how the avoidant mind was built and exactly what breaks it open. Stay with this. What comes next explains why silence is louder than anything you could have said. Control is not the same thing as strength, though most people confuse the two for their entire lives. The avoidant did not build walls because they were strong. They built walls because somewhere early in life closeness became associated with danger, and the nervous system never received the memo that danger had passed. Every action that looked like coldness was actually a survival strategy dressed up as independence. This is the first truth almost nobody wants to hear because it strips away the myth of the untouchable person and replaces it with something far more human and far more fragile. Detachment feels like power until the moment it stops working. That moment usually arrives quietly, without warning, in the form of an empty inbox or a silence that used to be filled with someone else's effort. The avoidant spent years perfecting the art of walking away first because walking away first meant never being the one left behind. But there is a hidden flaw in this strategy that almost never gets discussed. A person who always leaves first never learns what it feels like to be chosen without having to control the terms. That skill, the skill of receiving love without managing it, simply never develops. So when someone finally does the very thing the avoidant always did to others, something inside them short-circuits because the script has never been written from this angle before. Suffering has a strange intelligence to it, one that most people ignore because they are too busy trying to escape the discomfort. The discomfort the avoidant feels right now is not weakness leaking through the cracks. It is information. It is the nervous system finally receiving data it spent years avoiding, the data that says closeness did not kill you, and neither did the loss of control. Pain, when studied instead of numbed, becomes a teacher. Most people fire the teacher the moment class begins. Empaths carry their own blind spot inside this same story, and it is rarely spoken about with honesty. The empath often mistakes emotional access for emotional safety. They believe that because someone allows them to see their pain, that person has become safe to love. But access is not intimacy. A person can show you their wounds and still refuse to let you near their identity. This confusion is why so many empaths stay inside relationships that quietly consume them, mistaking the sharing of trauma for the building of trust. Nervous systems do not lie even when the mouth does. The avoidant may have said, with complete sincerity, that space was needed, that nothing was wrong, that everything would be fine. But the body operates on a different language entirely, one built on threat detection and old survival code. When distance is finally enforced by someone else, rather than chosen and controlled by the avoidant themselves, the body reads it as abandonment, not freedom. This is the paradox almost nobody explains correctly. The avoidant wanted space, but only space they controlled. Space given to them by someone else feels nothing like freedom. It feels like proof that their deepest fear was true all along. Identity is built brick by brick out of the roles a person plays under pressure. For years, the avoidant played the role of the one who was never affected, the one who could walk into any room and walk out untouched. That identity required an audience. It required someone on the other side who kept trying, kept reaching, kept absorbing the coldness, so the avoidant never had to feel its full weight. The moment that audience disappears, the role becomes impossible to perform because a performance without a witness collapses into something closer to the truth. Philosophers have spent centuries writing about the relationship between freedom and terror, and few truths apply more directly to this moment than the idea that man is condemned to be free. The avoidant is now facing an unfamiliar kind of freedom, the freedom of consequence without an audience to soften it. There is no one left to convince that everything is fine. There is only the self, alone with its own architecture, forced to look directly at what it built. Most people believe emotional mastery means the absence of emotion, and this belief quietly destroys more lives than almost any other misunderstanding in modern psychology. Emotional mastery is not numbness. It is the ability to feel the full intensity of an emotion without being ruled by it. The avoidant has spent years training themselves toward numbness, mistaking it for mastery, and now the very feelings they suppressed are demanding to be acknowledged all at once with interest. Silence in this specific moment is not empty. It is saturated with unspoken confrontation. Every unanswered question the avoidant refused to sit with in the past is now arriving without permission, uninvited, in the middle of an ordinary day. This is the second surprising truth buried inside this story. Avoidance does not delete unresolved emotion. It only postpones the invoice, and postponed invoices always arrive with additional cost attached. Human beings are remarkably skilled at building entire belief systems designed to protect themselves from a single unbearable thought. For the avoidant, that unbearable thought has always been the possibility that they are, in fact, deeply capable of being hurt. Every wall, every joke made to deflect vulnerability, every sudden need for space existed to protect that one fragile belief from ever being tested. Now, without their consent, the test has arrived anyway. Responsibility is where most self-improvement content quietly fails people because it is far easier to discuss feelings than to discuss ownership. The empath must eventually ask themselves an uncomfortable question: why did staying feel safer than leaving, even when leaving was clearly the healthier choice? The answer often has nothing to do with the avoidant at all, and everything to do with an old belief that love must be earned through endurance rather than received freely. Contradiction lives at the center of nearly every human relationship, and this story is no exception. The avoidant longed for closeness while actively sabotaging it. The empath longed for peace while repeatedly choosing chaos disguised as passion. Both people were, in their own way, chasing something they were simultaneously terrified of receiving. This is the third surprising truth, the one most attachment content refuses to name directly. Neither side was purely a victim. Both sides were unconsciously rehearsing an old wound, using each other as unwilling co-stars in a play written long before they ever met. Growth rarely announces itself with comfort. It arrives disguised as disorientation, as the uncomfortable sensation of an old identity no longer fitting the way it used to. The avoidant, sitting alone with a silence they did not choose, is standing at the exact threshold where transformation becomes possible, though nothing guarantees they will walk through it. Most people, faced with this threshold, choose the familiar pain of old patterns over the unfamiliar discomfort of real change. There is a particular kind of loneliness that only appears after a person has spent years perfecting the art of never needing anyone. And it does not resemble ordinary loneliness at all. Ordinary loneliness longs for company. This kind of loneliness longs for permission, permission to admit that the entire performance of self-sufficiency was, from the very beginning, a private negotiation with fear. The avoidant is now sitting inside that particular loneliness, and it does not feel like missing a person. It feels like meeting a stranger who has been living inside their own chest the entire time. Consequences operate on a delay that most people underestimate, especially those who built their identity around avoiding discomfort. A choice made in a single second, walking away, staying silent, refusing to reach out, often takes weeks or months to reveal its true weight. The avoidant is only now feeling the delayed weight of choices that once felt light and even righteous in the moment they were made. This delay is precisely what makes avoidant patterns so dangerous. The damage never announces itself immediately, so the behavior never gets corrected in time to prevent the loss. Attachment wounds do not care how intelligent a person is, how successful they appear, or how convincingly they explain their own detachment to others. A brilliant mind can construct an entire philosophy around independence, while the body underneath remains 6 years old, still bracing for a door that once closed too hard, or a parent who once turned away at the wrong moment. The avoidant's composed exterior was never a reflection of healed wounds. It was armor built around wounds that were never given the chance to speak. Power, real power, is not the ability to leave without looking back. That is not power. That is a nervous system in a permanent state of flight disguised as confidence. Real power is the ability to stay present inside discomfort without collapsing, without fleeing, without needing to control the outcome. The avoidant has never practiced this kind of power, because every relationship until now has been engineered, consciously or not, to avoid ever requiring it. There is a reason certain people are drawn again and again toward partners who cannot fully commit, and the reason has almost nothing to do with bad luck. The empath's nervous system often confuses intensity with intimacy, mistaking the anxious pull of uncertainty for the presence of real chemistry. Calm, secure love can feel almost boring to a system wired for chaos, because chaos, however painful, is at least familiar. Familiarity, even when it hurts, feels safer to the brain than the unfamiliar territory of peace. Somewhere in the architecture of the avoidance mind exists a belief formed long before adulthood, a belief that says being fully known is the same thing as being fully exposed to harm. This belief was likely never spoken aloud, never examined, never challenged, simply absorbed the way a child absorbs the emotional temperature of a household without understanding why. Every wall built afterward was constructed on top of that single unexamined belief, and no amount of adult success ever removed the original foundation. Grief is not reserved only for death. Grief also arrives when a person is forced to mourn the version of themselves they always believed they were. The avoidant believed they were unaffected, unbothered, immune. That belief is now dying, and grief always accompanies the death of an identity, even an identity built on a lie. This is uncomfortable to witness, but it is also the only doorway through which real change has ever entered a human life. Empaths often carry an invisible burden shaped like generosity, but rooted in something closer to fear, the fear that if they stop giving, they will stop being valuable to the people around them. This is rarely discussed honestly, because it is far more flattering to describe an empath as simply loving rather than examining the possibility that their love has, at times, been a strategy for securing safety rather than a pure expression of care. Both things can be true simultaneously, and pretending otherwise only delays the deeper healing available on the other side of that honesty. Trust is not built through grand declarations. It is built through thousands of small, unremarkable moments where a person could have chosen self-protection and instead chose presence. The avoidant never accumulated those moments, because every small moment of potential closeness was quietly redirected toward distance. Now, in the absence of the relationship, there is no accumulated trust to draw from, only the awareness of what should have been built and was not. Fear disguises itself brilliantly, and one of its favorite disguises is logic. The avoidant likely has an entire list of rational-sounding reasons explaining why the relationship needed to end, why distance was necessary, why things simply were not working. Some of these reasons may even be partially true, but underneath the logic often sits something far less rational, a primal aversion to vulnerability that predates every reason the conscious mind has ever constructed to explain it. Healing does not begin with forgiving another person. It begins far earlier than that, with the willingness to stop performing strength long enough to feel what is actually underneath it. The avoidant, in this moment of unwanted silence, has an opportunity most people never take. the opportunity to feel the fear directly instead of managing it from a safe emotional distance. Whether that opportunity gets used or wasted will determine far more about their future relationships than any single apology ever could. Meaning is rarely found in comfort. It is found in the willingness to sit inside discomfort long enough to extract the lesson hiding underneath it. This entire experience, painful as it is, contains a lesson neither person asked for and neither person will forget. The empath is learning that peace cannot be earned through overgiving. The avoidant is learning that control cannot protect a person from the very thing they were trying to avoid feeling in the first place. Both lessons arrive through loss because some lessons refuse to arrive any other way. There is an old idea, rarely applied correctly, that a person cannot heal what they refuse to name. The avoidant has spent years calling their fear independence, calling their withdrawal boundaries, calling their emotional absence peace. Each of these words functioned as a disguise, allowing something painful to hide inside language that sounded healthy. Naming things correctly is often the first act of real courage because once fear is called fear, it becomes far harder to keep dressing it up as strength. Betrayal does not always look like a dramatic act. Sometimes betrayal looks like consistent, quiet withholding, the slow withdrawal of presence disguised as busyness or fatigue. The avoidant likely never saw their own behavior as betrayal because nothing violent or obvious ever occurred, but absence repeated enough times becomes its own form of harm, even when no single moment can be pointed to as the offense. A wound left unexamined does not stay the same size. It grows, quietly, feeding on every situation that resembles the original injury, until a person finds themselves reacting to a grown adult with the intensity meant for a frightened child. This is why the avoidance response to closeness often seems disproportionate to the actual moment happening in front of them. The nervous system is not responding to the present relationship. It is responding to an old one, layered invisibly underneath the current situation. Empaths frequently misunderstand their own pattern of choosing emotionally unavailable partners, believing the pattern reflects bad judgment rather than a deeper psychological function. In truth, the unavailable partner often provides something the empath unconsciously seeks, a safe distance disguised as pursuit. Chasing someone who cannot fully arrive allows a person to experience the appearance of intimacy while never actually risking the terrifying vulnerability of being fully seen and still chosen. Discipline is often discussed only in relation to physical goals, gyms, diets, career achievements, while emotional discipline remains almost entirely ignored. Emotional discipline means feeling an urge, the urge to text, the urge to explain, the urge to control the narrative, and choosing not to act on it simply because the urge exists. The avoidant is now facing a test of emotional discipline unlike any test they have faced before, because for the first time the old strategy of retreating into control is not available to them. Somewhere beneath every avoidant pattern lives a child who once learned that needing someone was dangerous. That child never grew up in the emotional sense, even as the body around them aged into adulthood. The adult avoidant sitting now with an uncomfortable silence is not only facing the loss of a relationship, they are facing that same frightened child, finally old enough to ask the question that was never safe to ask before. What happens if I let myself need someone and they still choose to stay? Self-respect is frequently misunderstood as the ability to walk away without emotion. Real self-respect is something far quieter and far more demanding. It is the willingness to stay honest with oneself, even when honesty reveals uncomfortable truths about one's own contribution to the pain. The empath's self-respect is not measured by how much they gave. It is measured by whether they can finally acknowledge that giving without receiving was never love. It was survival dressed up as devotion. There exists a strange kind of arrogance hidden inside extreme self-sufficiency, though it rarely gets named this way. Believing that one can navigate life entirely without depending on another person is not humility. It is a quiet form of grandiosity, an unconscious belief that needing others is beneath oneself. The avoidance collapse into unexpected emotion right now is not weakness breaking through strength. It is reality breaking through an illusion of superiority that was never sustainable to begin with. Every ending carries inside it an invitation, though almost nobody accepts the invitation while the pain is still fresh. The invitation is simple and brutal in its simplicity. Become someone capable of the relationship you were unable to sustain. This requires far more than apology. It requires the uncomfortable, unglamorous work of rebuilding the internal architecture that made closeness feel like danger in the first place. Philosophy has long wrestled with the difference between suffering that destroys a person and suffering that transforms one, and the difference rarely lies in the suffering itself. It lies in what the person does with the silence that follows. The avoidant can use this silence to construct new justifications, new walls, new stories that protect the old identity, or the silence can be used as raw material for something entirely different, a rebuilding of self that no longer requires distance as a form of safety. Nothing about this moment guarantees transformation. Pain alone has never been enough to change a person. What matters is whether the avoidant chooses awareness over comfort, chooses to sit inside the discomfort of their own reflection rather than reaching for the nearest distraction. Most people choose distraction. A smaller number choose to look directly at what the silence is revealing, and that smaller number are the ones who eventually build relationships capable of surviving real intimacy. The empath, meanwhile, faces a parallel invitation of their own, though it looks different on the surface. Their work is not to become colder or more guarded, but to learn the difference between loving someone and rescuing them from themselves. Real love does not require the erasure of one's own needs. It requires two people capable of showing up as they are, without one person constantly shrinking to accommodate the other's fear. Somewhere in the quiet after this moment, both people will be handed the same choice, though it will look different on each side. Repeat the pattern or finally understand it. The avoidant cannot control what happens next, and this time that lack of control is not a threat. It is an opportunity. The block was never really about punishment. It was a mirror, held up without permission, showing exactly what years of distance were designed to avoid feeling. Do not look away from what this reveals about you, whichever side of this story belongs to you. Sit with the discomfort tonight instead of numbing it. Ask the question you have been avoiding, the one about why closeness felt like danger, or why staying felt like the only way to matter. Nothing changes through insight alone. It changes through the decision made in the silence that follows it. Some doors do not close to punish us. They close so we finally turn around and face the one we have been avoiding our entire life, ourselves.